Hi, my name is Naomi Van Doren, and I'm going to be sharing with you the process behind my watercolor artwork, starting here in Photoshop. I always begin my projects in Photoshop because it's the easiest way to kind of navigate and organize an idea. So first off, I will just begin sketching. Often I have a few ideas, so up here I've included the themes that I wanted to explore for this piece. I wanted it to be a fox dragon, which is one of my character creatures that I draw frequently. It's also a series that I've been doing for a while. I also wanted it to have some kind of like foliage. I really enjoy drawing and painting foliage of some kind. And then I also wanted it to also have a theme of books or some kind of drawing and art. And the fox dragon would have a character and a companion in it. So with those in mind, I set about pulling aside a couple of my own illustrations. These are pieces that I've done in the past. I often reference my own work if I'm adding to a series. So this one right here is a part of a Fox Dragon series, and the other two are just other illustrations. I decided to just kind of sketch, and as I work through those ideas, eventually I'll come to something like this. This is the sketch that I landed on, and really I felt like it hit home for what it is I was looking for. From here is when I really began to refine it. So that refinement process begins in stage 2. Basically, this is where I'm going to be exploring this idea as an illustration, as a finished painting and not just a sketch. Sometimes what I'll do with this is I'll actually start off with just doing a little bit of brainstorming, sort of writing, like why is my character here? What are they doing? What I've done is I began my sketching process, and I was kind of playing around with a couple of different compositions here. So I have this first composition, which is my initial first idea. Then after that, I decided to play around with a secondary idea and just move my fox dragon up. I wanted to see and visualize what it looked like if the character was sitting in the fox dragon, sort of nestled in there. But I really actually ended up going back to this first one where the character is just kind of sitting slightly above the fox dragon. Next, we have the sketch phase 2. This is where I start to pull in ideas and really kind of sort of refine my composition. Often what I'll do here is, and you can see it here, I've pulled in some colors and clips of other illustrations that I've done. I use this as a way to quickly come up with a finished sort of look, at least as far as a composition goes. If I've created something that's similar before, I can kind of self-reference a little bit. The only point of this is to really just move along my idea to something that I can then do a finished line work over the top. As you can also see here, I've started to experiment with color, and I've started to lay in some of the color on my character and really just get a feel for what that kind of finished color piece is going to look like. Moving on to my last sketch phase. This is when it all really just comes together. So I have color here on the bottom that is been just kind of roughly, loosely added in. This color layer is what I'm going to use for my color comp, basically an image that I will use as reference for when I'm painting and planning a painting. Then I have the line work. The line work is still fairly rough, but I do have a lot more refinement in here. Next, I have just some overlay layers and then a few final things that I added in. Typically, if I am doing an illustration and there is some kind of character, obviously any sort of objects, I will draw through that object. So you can still see some of the ones for the tree here. These are all giant cylinders, so these were drawn through to kind of create and design the piece. Even the boulders back here were all designed using that same technique, just so I understand where stuff sits in 3D space. It's not to really necessarily make it boxy. I just like that look and that style. You can round these out and make them much more soft and organic, if you like. Just something to consider if you're designing an environment and not using a lot of reference or any reference at all is all this stuff can be designed from the ground up. Once I have that illustration complete, I move on to the final line work phase. Now I've created a new document. This is my finished line work document, and this is where I create the finished line. I have a preset brush over here that I use, and this is just a brush that I've created using pencil from, I believe it was Kyle T. Webster's pencils. So this is just something I go to, and it has a color that I prefer to use frequently. So new canvas has the correct size that we're going to be printing this out on. So with printing in mind, I've already set up crop marks that are here in the corners. So those are over here. And also I will be removing this box around the illustration. I've just left that there for you to be able to see. So once I've done my illustrations, I actually have left on the color comp here in the back. This color comp, as I mentioned before, is what I'm going to be using to reference when I'm working in traditional paint. When I'm working in watercolor, I like to have something that I can refer to that kind of gives me a guide for painting. So what I'm going to do, in order to be able to print this piece, I don't want all of my colored lines to be uniform. So the last step that I'm going to do before we print this out, I'm going to take this color layer and copy it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create basically colored lines using that colored layer. So when you do, when you create a clipping mask with that color over top, that is how you get this look right here. But it's not complete. As you can see, there's some areas that the line just doesn't show up correctly. It looks a little bit funny in some of these lighter areas. That's not going to be useful for me because I do want those lines to show up. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the eyedropper tool, or I hit I for the shortcut, and we're going to go up here and change sample all layers to sample current layer. And this is going to allow you to have your color layer selected and sample colors that you cannot currently see. So I'll just set a big brush. You can just use the default soft brush. It really doesn't matter for this. And just go around and kind of fix some of those lines to make them a little bit darker using the sampling the eyedropper tool to pick up colors that are nearby so that you see how you can create it just to be a little bit darker. The leaves, for example, up here, I would like to be all sort of a darker pink or purple color. So I'll just go around and sample anything that looks like it's out of place. Like these right here, for example, are just too light. Yes, there'll be light shining from behind them, but I'm going to create that light effect with a watercolor. I want the lines around the object to still be sort of dark. One thing that I do that I didn't mention before is sometimes I will do a box blur on my color layer. This just allows my colors to kind of just blur a little bit more. I don't want really harsh transitions between colors. I want everything to feel very smooth and gradient-like. So I believe we have everything. I'm just going to pan around real quick and make sure that I didn't miss any areas. So we are complete. One last step, if you want to reintroduce some more contrast into your work, is you can add just adjustment layers on top of this. If you want to create a little bit more contrast, you can use these to keep the color that you've created, but also create a little bit more pop, or also create a little bit more saturation. It just depends on what it is you're going for. So the next phase of this illustration process is rather unique. What I do is, instead of light boxing or transferring my illustration line work to paper, I actually ended up printing it out. What I'm using here is an Epson P800. And this is a pigment-based ink printer. So what you would maybe print like a really nice fancy print on. I've also used a local Giclée printer to do this as well. Basically, the printer needs to be able to print on a watercolor cardstock. The paper I'm using here is Arches paper. This is 140 weight, so it's fairly thick, and my printer can take cardstock up to 300-pound paper as well. The important part of printing onto paper is that the ink is pigment-based. Essentially, that means that it will be waterproof and also archival. If you don't have a printer like this, you can also print out your line work and use a light box, a window, or any other transferring method to get your line work onto watercolor paper. So for the traditional portion of this tutorial, I want to walk you through the tools that I'm going to be using, starting with paper. So I've already printed out my illustration line work onto watercolor paper. The paper that I'm using is Arch's hot press paper. This is 140 weight, and the size of the paper is 10 by 14. I also work on cold press Arch's watercolor paper. I find that both are great, and I use them fairly interchangeably. Next, I have on my desk my reference. This is the color comp that I showed you in Photoshop. This is just pulled up on my iPad, and I often plug in my iPad so I can just leave this open while I'm working. After that, I have my working space. So right now I have a piece of hardboard down on my white desktop. That's just to protect the surface in case I get paint elsewhere. I typically will mount my watercolor paper to a hardboard surface. This is just something that will keep the paper from warping while I'm working on it. To tape it down, I use artist tape. This is just a really nice white tape that will secure your paper to a hard surface. I have paper towels. I like to use a bamboo paper towel. And I also have my 2 watercolor palettes. This is my Daniel Smith watercolors, and these are my Holbein and Turner watercolors. Now I've actually gone ahead and I keep a swatch of what watercolors are in each pan just to have reference. Obviously I do experiments and stuff beforehand. I have my brushes. Some of these are the brushes I use all the time. Some of my favorites are the Princeton Neptune brushes. These are like a synthetic brush that I really enjoy. I also enjoy using the Zen Royal and Langnickel brushes. These are fairly inexpensive and I can go through those fairly quickly, but they're great for what I need them for. A few of these other brushes I have that are just used for different purposes, like this one. This one I use for wetting down my paper, and that's about the only time I ever use it. Over here I have my watercolor mixing palette. This is what I'll be using to sample my watercolors in and then mix them over here. I also have some jam jars or glass jars that I keep my water in. I like to have at least 2. One is for fresh water and the other one is for just rinsing a brush in. I also use a bunch of old paper towels that just lay here and soak up water and paint and stuff. This is just something that I've been using for years. It's just been added to gradually. In case I need it, I do have another tray here for mixing and a bottle for misting down either my paints or also my canvas. And sometimes, occasionally, I drop water to put in this tray as well. Once I have my workspace set up, I am ready to get started. I tape down my piece of watercolor paper to a hardboard. This is just a really sturdy surface that will help my paper stay flat while I'm working on it. I tape it down using an artist tape. It's just an art paper tape that you'll be able to remove without tearing the paper when you're finished. One tip that you can do in order to keep your tape from tearing the paper is to adhere it to something that has like a little bit of texture, like your pants. This can help take away some of the stickiness of the tape if it happens to be a poor quality, that it's just too sticky. Also make sure that when you're removing the tape that you are not taking it up off of paper that's wet. As long as the paper is dry and your paper is of good quality, you shouldn't have any problems with removing it. I use a spray bottle to wet down my watercolor palettes. My first step of any watercolor painting is creating watercolor test swatches. These swatches allow me to experiment with the paints that I have in my palettes and see what colors I'm going to mix together. Often when I'm working, I use a lot of different colors that I sort of mix on the painting itself, So knowing what the paint is going to do beforehand is really important. I'm just using scraps of watercolor paper that I have around the studio. Often I'll end up with lots of scraps of paper depending on a project. Also, if I have any discarded paintings that didn't necessarily work out, the backs of those is great for this. Once I'm happy with my test swatches, I'm ready to get started with the actual painting process. The first stage is wetting down the entire paper. I use a spray bottle and a large brush to make sure that the entire surface is fairly wet before I get started. It's really important that you get your paper damp, but not so wet that there are puddles of water on top of your paper. Getting it damp before you do this first wash of color will allow the colors to kind of smoothly transition from one to another. Because I'm working from light to dark, I want this first layer to be the really lightest parts of the image. And it's going to be a lot of yellows and soft blues and purples, and I want those to kind of blend seamlessly together. After this first wash has dried, I'm ready to move on to my second layer of paint. My first wash is establishing where my major colors are going to be, and the second wash is kind of reiterating that. It's important to make sure that you are layering colors on top of each other that are going to complement each other or really enhance the same color over and over again. You're going to create really muddy colors by painting too many confusing colors on top of one another. If you start layering warms and cools and then back to warms, again, in general, that's a really good recipe for creating really muddy color. This is where it helps to have my color comp or color guide. I already know where my general areas of color are going to be because I have a guide just off screen that is helping me to figure out what goes where beforehand. In general, I like to work between 3 to 6 layers of paint. I feel like doing too many layers of paint really starts to make a piece look like it's overworked. One technique that I use often to create very soft gradients in a painting is to wet the area that I plan on working on first with a clean brush. I then go in and add the watercolor pigment after. This allows me to control where the watercolor paint is going to go without worrying about it spilling over into unwanted areas. This second phase of layering is really building up the colors in my piece. I'm pulling in a lot of bold, bright colors and layering them up as I go. This is really helping to establish the vibrancy in the painting and creating those pops of color all over the canvas. When I work, I'm often working in different locations on a piece. Especially when it's this large, it really allows me to work longer on a piece without worrying about drying times. I have to make sure that everything is dry before I work on that layer again. Otherwise, I'll end up with strange, odd textures that were not intended. The second and third layer of paint is also establishing a lot of the textures in the piece. Using a round brush, I'm able to really highlight some of the textures in certain areas with a little bit of contrast and added color. You'll notice, depending on the paint that you're using, that some paints behave very differently than others. There are some paints in my palette that are Daniel Smith paints, and some of these tend to have a granulating effect. Basically, the pigment in the paint is just larger and it will kind of float around in the water and create really cool, interesting textures as it separates out. As you get to know your paint, you'll understand that this happens and you'll figure out where to use those colors best. I like to use some of these granulating paints in a lot of my shadow areas, or areas where I want to have a lot of cool, interesting textures, like the foliage in this piece. The very final stages of a painting is just adding the last few little details. Often these are the shadow elements and any little highlights or little accent colors that I want to create. And there you have it. That is my process. If you like this video, I hope you will come and find me on social media. I really enjoy sharing a lot of my process online. You can find me anywhere by searching Naomi Van Doren. I look forward to seeing you there.